get nutritionals into my existing spray program?
Definitely. When we think nutritionals, it can be a little intimidating. But the nice thing about nutritional programs is we can put them in the tank when you're already going across the field. So you're making a post pass with your herbicide. We can put it in the tank then. You're making a fungicide. We can put it in the tank then. But I do want to caution you, right? When we think about mixing different nutritionals, the type of nutritional and the raw ingredients really do matter. Take glyphosate and manganese, right? Two really common instances that we look at. You put the wrong form of manganese in, you tie up your glyphosate, and we end up with two separate problems. So the great thing is we can put it in when we're going, but I do want to urge you to pay attention to what you're putting in and the form that you're using.
What does Ag Explore think the next big shift in plant nutrition is?
Corey, we believe that the biggest shift in plant nutrition is all about technology and actually driving that plant nutrition inside of plants. You know, we hear about the 4 R's in plant nutrition, the right product, right rate, right time, right place, but it's really that 5th R, that right technology to help drive that plant nutrition inside that plant and make it function at a higher level so you see better ROI on your farm. So we contend that there's so much more to learn and for us to gain in agriculture by understanding these technologies that drive that plant nutrition inside of plants. That's where we're spending our time at.
Hey, it's Tanner here with Farm for Profit, hanging out with Brent, the Director of Sales from Ag Explorer, and today I'm going to learn about how I can actually tell which micros I am short on.
So Tanner, they're called micros for a reason. You don't need very many of them. And it's just a hard thing to manage. So you can do multiple things. You can soil sample, tissue sample in season. A lot of things because of the year and depending on what situation you're going in. A lot of times the micros are just something that you could approach in your cropping system that you just try to handle every single year. So there's some products that looks like a shotgun approach where it might have a mixture of different micros. But depending on what that year throws at you, you might not know how they're going to react. You know, we have the option from a foliar standpoint or from a seed treatment standpoint where you could have a blend of micros that try to meet that crop's need throughout the year.
PGR, what is it? And then what is in Onward Max?
Yep, so a PGR, it's a regulator. So we can think about it as a signaler. People call it hormones. But what it's doing is we're applying it to the plant to bring about some type of change. So let's talk Onward Max. Onward Max is a 3-way PGR, specifically designed for that late season. So it has kinetin, has choline chloride, and then it has the Aaron Judge, I like to call it, it has GABA that's going to be in there, which I think is the big heavy hitter, right?
Yep.
It's the home runs when we go in and we need them.
Yep.
So kinetin and choline chloride, they've been around since the 1970s, right? You think 5 traditional PGRs, they kind of fall into that window. Kinetin is all about reproductive success, flowering, pollination. That's where I put my kinetin late season. Choline chloride, I think, is a really neat kind of older PGR because what choline chloride does is it helps keep the chlorophyll from breaking down. We get late season, the sunlight starts to kind of shorten up, we get some stresses, our plants start to yellow. That what's happening is the plants are naturally breaking down that chlorophyll. The problem with that is then we lose grain fill duration. I really think that's one of the biggest yield components we have because if I can gain myself an extra 10, 14, 21 days of grain fill, now all of a sudden I'm talking test weight. And then the third one is that GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid. And there's 2 big things with that. Stress mitigation. And so we know plants can get stressed just like you and I do.
Yeah.
But GABA does the same thing in plants. It helps to mitigate that ethylene, which is a stress hormone. Hey, well, welcome back to another edition of From the Field, where we're going to start focusing on what happens once we get the seeds in the ground and we start to get the crops germinating. And this week, I am joined by my good friend and fellow Midwest agronomist, Ben Westendorf. Ben, it is great to have you back on here.
John, I'm having deja vu. I feel like we just did this, but it's been over 2 years since we've done this.
I agree. It's been a few years, but I'm going to tell you the weather is about the same. We've got some rain coming down. It's cool and it's spring, but it seems like we've had a lot of, we'll call them road bumps along the way. I don't know about up in your area.
Oh, that's a pretty good summary of what we've been experiencing here in central Iowa. You know, in your mind, you try to go back and recall where everything was at. Seems like we got just a day or two for guys to get hog manure and anhydrous put on, you know, mid to end of March. And then April, they turned the rain on again. Somewhere around April, I think it was 17th, 18th, 19th in there. We had an early opportunity to go get some stuff planted. I wouldn't say it was a great opportunity, but some of us pushed it, which was a great way to get the rotary hoe pulled out of the grove. Do some rotary hoeing. We got some crusting, a lot of sidewall smear that turned really hard. So not a great opportunity, but here we are at a field of corn that was planted May 5th. So corn planting and planting in general is pretty much wrapped up around here.
Nice. Spring down in Missouri has kind of been the same. You and I were actually supposed to be doing this. I was going to be on my farm. You're going to be on yours. We had a good flooding rain the last couple days, and it was raining this morning while I had to take off for work. So I'm standing up by Davenport, Iowa. You're kind of over on the other side of the state. But I agree with you. Even down south, right, we had our challenges. We were able to get in pretty early, have some great-looking crops. In fact, a lot of guys are already running post-pass down there in southern Missouri. You and I work with some great guys that are even further south in Arkansas and Tennessee, and they've been running side dress and nitrogen. And it's just interesting to get a chance to just work with everybody across the United States in terms of what we get to see and what we get to learn. So, Ben, this
Absolutely.
week, as we kind of jump back into this from the field, we're really going to focus on what does it take, or how, I guess, really, how can we drive efficiency in growing our crop, right? Kind of setting that potential. And in my mind, initially, I'm standing in a great no-till soybean field. In my mind, I'm like, man, it's too early to be thinking about it. And you're standing there in your cornfield planted a couple weeks ago, and we're like, man, we're just getting seeds out of the ground. We got a great stand, it looks like, behind you. But really, this is a key time for us to be thinking about some really key, let's call them practices, nutrients, however you want to word it, to really start driving success later on in the year. So, Ben, when you
I
think
can't agree
about
with that
driving
anymore.
success, yep. Go ahead, bud.
Yeah, I was just going to say I couldn't agree with that anymore, John. We planted our corn here at 35,000. I haven't taken the exact time to go out and see what we got. Visually, we're pretty darn close. I'd say we're all of 34, 33, 34,000. So in your head, you automatically start progressing to the next steps. What are we going to do to manage this crop next? We have that pre-emerge pass put down with the 32%. We're managing that nitrogen. Seems like we're checking the boxes as we're progressing forward. So I think that's what we're going to talk about today is on steps post-emerge herbicide pass as well as side dress pass. Kind of those next 2, 3, 4 steps here. What are we going to be looking at?
Yeah, I think that's perfect. And if you don't care, let's start with that herbicide pass, right? You've got a great looking clean field behind you. I know a lot of guys were going down and we're putting a good mix of pre's down. We're getting good residual activity. But we also know when we get some rain and maybe crops are a little slow getting out of the ground, we have to make sure we take care of that weed competition. So, Ben, when you kind of think about a post pass, what are some things that come to mind that are really going to really pay dividends probably later down the road?
Yeah, so I'll kind of step off camera here, and you can see that we are looking at a pretty clean field. This is a corn-on-corn situation, so I got hit with a ripper last fall, and then to make a nice seed bed, we do run a field cultivator over it, which is a form of weed control. But then we also hit it with a residual. We don't have any, like 2,4-D or Roundup in it as far as like a contact killer, but we do run like an acetylchloratrazine premix as a residual. But as we're starting to look at that next step, here in 3, 4, probably more like 4 weeks, because we're looking at a V1 corn plant now. We're trying to hit it again at that V4, maybe moving into that V5-ish, tall plant. Couple things that come to mind. One, really, first off the bat is sulfur. I feel like our sulfur program is good, but I'm always looking to try something else because I feel like sulfur is the one thing that we can do that will always pay. So I've been playing around with it a little bit in the past, but one thing that I haven't done a lot of is foliarly applied. And I think one thing that we think of is, well, that's because we need, so many pounds. And in our mind, foliarly applied, you're not going to get the pounds. Well, that's true, but we're not asking to put all the pounds out there, right, with the foliar sulfur program. We're just asking to put a little bit, can we add a little bit, can it be more efficient for us? So That being said, I think it's important to take a look back at what we've done with sulfur in the past so we can understand that what we're doing now, how it's different. So when we started to discover sulfur that, we're deficient, we're not receiving it out of the air anymore, everyone jumped right away to elemental. And that was good, it worked. But we started to figure out that sulfate is a much better form, more available for these plants to take up. So like an ammonium sulfate is the most available. I'm not saying we use all that, but we do use some KTS or ATS with our side dress pass. But we're going to start incorporating some foliar fed sulfur here this year.
Ben, I think that's a really good point when we think about sulfur, and it doesn't matter if we're thinking soybeans, we're thinking corn, really even your wheats, your pulse crops, everything like that. Sulfur is such a key component, and I really feel like sulfur deficiency is kind of like slowly snuck up on us, right? We used to get it all for free, and now we find ourselves getting, 3 to 5 pounds of sulfur from the atmosphere every year. But like you said, it can be easy. Sometimes I get in my own mind, and when we talk with people, they're like, oh, it's got to get complicated, right? It's going to be complex and it's going to be hard, but it doesn't have to be, right? Like you said, we can run an ATS, a KTS, an AMS, all getting sulfur out there. Or like you said, let's reallocate. And I love that fact because when we think about nitrogen, right, for years, for decades, it's been preached, let's put that nitrogen out a little bit at a time. Let's give it a couple of different shots. So I love the fact that you're talking about doing that with crops because it's about getting it where it needs to be and when it needs to be, right, at that right time. So Ben, when you go out and you think about sulfur, one thing that's always really impressed me about your farm is you have a really solid sulfur program, right? I don't think you guys skimp on sulfur, but yet you're still talking about kind of reallocating. So kind of step me through that process. With such a strong sulfur program, why are you reallocating some of it to in season?
The simple answer is I think it's utilized better, but the longer answer, if I kid, is we started with like a 15-1, is what we were shooting for our sulfur. Then it come out, we need 10-1. Last year, I started playing with it a little bit more, increasing it even greater, more to like that 8-1, and we still see the response. So if we're still seeing the response, we haven't found that point of diminishing return yet. So let's push it a little bit more. Now, sure, we can do that in the form of coultering it in with our 32% when we're side dressing, and we will. But if I want to get better utilization out of it, why not put a little bit with that post-emerge pass as well?
Yeah, I love that, right? It's kind of that right time, right place, right? Those R's that we always talk about. As well as talking about sulfur, though, there are other key things I think that we can look at in this time frame. And one of them that you and I spent a lot of time this winter getting a chance to talk with people about is potassium, right? So as we kind of think back to last fall, right, fertilizer prices were kind of creeping up or jumping sky high, right? However you want to look at that. Commodity prices weren't really the best when we were kind of looking at corn and soybeans. And I know myself and a lot of other guys, we kind of pulled back on that dry a little bit, right? Weren't really quite sure where we wanted to be, what crops were going to look like, really for sure, even the marketing programs. But then we get a chance to walk these fields and take a look at your field, and we have such a great opportunity, right? And so when we get in that in season, in my mind, that's not necessarily where we start thinking about potassium. But talk to me about some things you've seen with potassium in season over the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's a great point, John. So I also, I had to cut back on my dry program unintentionally. I didn't want to, but things were tight when I was doing that prepay season. The outlook on the futures price were not great. So I had to set my household budget, right? I'm going to spend X amount in this category and that's it. Well, now here we are, fast forward 3-4 months. Now we got a pretty decent futures price, they're going to start playing around on. So, yeah, I'm going to be looking at maybe using some potassium acetate with my side dress application. So I also think it's really important to talk about this, John, because I'm not a fancy farmer. I have this little 11 knife Coulter bar DMI bar but it's a great opportunity to get a gallon of potassium acetate out there. And I think it's an important thing to talk about potassium acetate, and I'd like you to go into greater detail on it. But we found out way back when Texas A&M, or I think it was Texas A&M, did a study that says potassium acetate is 4.5 times more available than any other potassium on the market. So when we start talking about putting down potash, right, that's a long-term play. You got to have it. You need it there for your base saturation. However, if we need something right now, immediately for that crop, we need to be using potassium acetate.
Yeah, I love that, right? And you kind of brought it up, right? We know we need to build on our soils and try to elevate those levels. But when we think about potassium acetate, the great thing about it is it really can be used in a lot of different areas, right? It's almost like a utility product because that acetate is going to wrap up that charge, right? It's a carbon sugar type molecule and it makes it mobile. So if you come in and you side dress, typically we'd say, oh, potassium's going to get locked up in those clay layers and we're not going to move very much. But we know that potassium acetate is going to move toward those roots. And it's not that we're trying to replace hundreds of pounds, right? It's just like that sulfur and just like that nitrogen. Once that crop starts going up, so does the demand. And we're trying to help just put a few extra pounds right there where the crop needs it. And really, there's two big plays. And Ben, when we think about those big plays, the first one that comes to my mind, and you guys in Iowa, is windstorms. Right? I was up there last year. You guys were getting like 40-mile-an-hour winds. It just seems like Iowa year after year gets hit by winds. But potassium is such a key thing with stalk quality, right? That standability. And getting just a little bit more early in the season can really pay some big dividends. But the other part of it is it really helps us utilize what's in our soil more efficiently. And so when we think about what potassium does, if we think about the bottom of those leaves, those corn leaves that you have right there, they're covered in stomates, right? All those little holes. And those stomates are just like big straws, right? I think about Pizza Hut straws. They're going from the leaf all the way down into the soil. Well, if we can keep those open, we can extract more nutrients. And potassium is one of the key nutrients that helps those stomates stay open so that we can harvest more of that. So I really look at potassium in that early season as kind of fulfilling those two roles. Let's set us up for some good stock. But years like this, let's maximize what's in the soil by helping our plants extract what's already there.
Yep,
So Ben,
I couldn't have said it any better, John. So that's definitely something we're going to be looking at doing differently this year is running just a gallon or two of a potassium acetate. You can get fancy with it. You can include some humics in that if you want, which kind of leads us to our next topic about some things that I think are pushing yield around this time is this use of biostimulants. There's a lot of great products, potassium acetate products that also include an organic acid, or we could just run an organic acid by itself. And I think that's also something we're going to be looking at doing this year with our side dress application of 32%. It's become very popular, I would say, in the last year or two is this idea of using a humic acid in the soil to stabilize our nitrogen. Or, maybe we shouldn't use the word stabilize because I think stabilize has a very different meaning than what we're using it for here. But we're going to be using a humic acid to keep it in that ammonium form for that corn plant to find when it needs it a little later on. I don't know if you've been seeing that in your travels, but I sure have, man. I know that.
Yeah, I agree with you, right? Carbon has just become this hot topic. And you can talk, man, carbon positive crops like yours or carbon negative crops. And we can talk about what's happening in the soil. But when you think about that humic or that fulvic, right, it's that carbon base. It's almost like a backbone that we're looking at. And there's so many good qualities. Like you said, it helps hold nutrients. It can kind of self-chelate, right, some of those. And then also it's great for the soil. And when we think about that, the biostimulants, the biologicals, that's such an important conversation going forward, especially with the new farm bill, right? There's an entire section in there now that's going to start focusing on like these carbons and that next hot topic, biostimulants, right? And biostimulants, you and I have got a chance to do a lot of meetings and farm shows over the winter. And biostimulants is something everybody wants to talk about. But I'm not always sure that we have the best explanation because there's so much that goes on in there. So Ben, what are a couple of biostimulants you've been seeing? And in your mind with this post pass, where's some good placement for those?
John, this is a very overwhelming category of ag business. Like you said, you go walk around a farm show, whether it be Farm Progress or Commodity Classic or just a regional show, and there's going to be hundreds, maybe even thousands of companies with their spin on a biostimulant. I like to think of two right off the bat, excluding a humic or a fulvic. But when we think of a couple biostimulants, I immediately think of an amino acid, whether it be a straight amino or a refined amino acid. We're going to work at the stress mitigation. And generally, when we think of stress, we're thinking of heat and drought. However, that's not exactly the case all the time. In this situation, I know over there you might be dealing with wind right now. A tattered leaf is stressed still. Here, we're looking at maybe a little hypoxic situation, right? No oxygen. We have too much water. Now, I don't think it's going to be enough to affect this crop too much yet. But in a situation like that, we're going to be dealing with too much water. It can help with that as well, an amino acid. The second one, and this is really where things start to branch off, right? Like a Venn diagram, if you will. A seaweed extract. However, there's different types of seaweed that's extracted. There's different processes of extraction, and all of them add just a little bit of spin on it, right? It's like a sucker. A sucker is good. However, is it a dum dum, or is it a blow pop, or is it a tootsie pop, right? And what flavor of it is it? It's all going to accomplish the same kind of thing, giving that plant a little bit of stress reduction, but it does it in a little bit different ways. So one thing that I've been seeing is a good seaweed extraction that's been done through a biochemically process is going to be a better seaweed than, say, like a traditionally extracted.
Yep. And I think there's a really good place to put that because, like you said, typically when we think stress, we think heat, right? We think drought, things like that. But cool temperatures, right? Lack of sunlight, cool nights, extra water, or a herbicide pass, right? As we're coming through on the post, all of that's a stressor. And especially even when we're dealing with tolerant crops, right? Great genetics and they're great hybrids. But I like to think about there's still a tax, right? There's still a cost to putting that on. It still has to metabolize it. So I think it's a great opportunity to kind of help reduce that stress. I mean, again, we get back to this situation where last fall, we were a little nervous about things. This spring, we're like, man, we've got a good crop. We've got to make sure that we capitalize on what we have, right? We really want to drive that yield. And then as we kind of move with that biostimulant, I'll tell you the last two kind of nutrients that come to my mind, really hot topic, it seems like, are molybdenum and boron. And I'm going to start calling molybdenum Molly because I'm going to struggle to say it 25 times. But we like to think about Molly and boron as a micro, but it's really the micro of micros, right? We're not even talking pounds. We're not necessarily talking tenths of pounds. Sometimes we're talking hundredths of a pound. And the interesting thing is both our soybeans, our corn, our wheat, everything needs those two nutrients as we start to move through. So Ben, talk to me a little bit. I know you worked with an agronomist down in Tennessee, Ryan, that we work with, and you guys were talking about running some Molly with UAN. Kind of talk me through why now and what's it really doing?
Yep. I'm glad you're standing in a soybean field because this gives us an opportunity to talk about both crops in a little bit different role. Funny enough, it both has to do with nitrogen, right? So when we use Molly in a corn crop, if we like to think of this analogy of a car, I'm looking back here at my 1993 Polaris four-wheeler. It's a two-stroke, in case you're wondering, John. So it's a little bit different. But when we think about it, Molly is the key that I have at the ignition, right? It's the key for that nitrogen to be utilized within a corn plant. While in a soybean plant, it's needed a little bit differently, and I'll let you do that explaining. But it's so tough because we don't actually know how much we need, right? It's so tough to say, oh, you got to have this many ounces or pounds per this many removal, or so like we have figured out for every other nutrient. But I can tell you a little bit goes a long ways, and it's best to split it up a little bit. So a couple ounces of like a 16% Molly or so is going to go a long ways with the side dress application. And I'll let you touch on soybeans.
Yeah, I think that's perfect though, right? You said just a little bit. And whether we're talking soybeans or corn, it's all about nitrogen efficiency. So in our soybeans, right, we go out and if these had a couple more trifoliates, we dig them up, we look at the nodules, and we love to see that bright pink, right, nodule on there. It means, oh man, I'm fixing atmospheric nitrogen, I'm pumping it down into the plant. Well, that's due partially, right, outside of the idea that we inoculated that soybean with bradyrhizobium, but to an enzyme called nitrogenase. And that enzyme is just part of that conversion of N2, that's the free atmosphere, or nitrogen in the atmosphere, into a plant available form. Now, it's very similar, like you said, in corn, and it's why it pairs so well, we think, with a UAN application, is it's part of an enzyme that's called nitrate reductase, which just simply says, hey, we're going to pull that nitrate out of the soil, but we're not just going to leave it in the plant as nitrate. This enzyme helps us convert it over. And I love the fact you brought up your two-stroke, because I always think about Molly as my square body Chevy. And I know you're younger than I am. You probably don't even remember the good trucks. But if you guys remember those old keys that used to slide into the ignition, right? And you'd feel all the little rollers kick up. And then you get to the last one and the key just kind of drops down. You can turn it over. That's what Molly is. So as I think about like your sulfur program, man, you're already splitting your nitrogen. You're already getting sulfur on, and we're getting it on at multiple times. That's really where Molly can start to pay huge dividends. This year, with the way that nitrogen's priced, we have to be efficient, right? We can't leave it not utilized, right, in the plant or in the field. And that's where I love to see that Molly component in there. So Ben, as we think Molly, and as we kind of wrap up this nutritional side, the last part that I think would be interesting to talk about would be boron. So kind of walk me through, what do you see in terms of boron applications? How has your view of that changed over time?
That's a good thing. We just got done with the square body Chevy. I'm glad you aged yourself as well, because when we think of those old pickups, hell, it could be an old Camry too. When we turn that key, right, then all of a sudden our antennas start extending. And if these corn plants were just a little bit taller, I'd show you what that's looking like. But boron early season is literally the nutrient responsible for elongating those nodes inside of that corn plant, right? It's responsible for that growth. Now it has a little bit a different role later on in the season, but right now that's what boron's doing. But John, thanks for bringing that up of how my view has changed a little bit on that. On our farm, it used to just be treat the dry fertilizer with boron, right? Put a dry boron out there, spread it. Well, there we go. We got our boron taken care of. Well, when we think about it, in a lot of situations, we don't need that much boron, right? 0.2 of a pound or so, depending on yield goals and what you have in the soil, which generally is not much. I think boron is one nutrient that you should absolutely consider switching over to a foliar application, because you can meet, I got to be careful how I say this, because if you have an 800 bushel yield goal, we probably can't figure that out with foliar applications. But if you have something like a 200, 220, 240, 250 yield goal, we can pretty much accomplish all of those boron needs with the foliar application of boron.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And it's interesting that you bring that up, right? Because early season, it's all about developing that plant. And it just takes me back to think, again, we're standing in these fields, and I mean, we think, man, we've still got a long way to go before we're going to run combines through them. But all of these things that we've talked about today is all about setting up that yield. Right here in a couple leaf collars on your plant, we're going to start setting ear shoots. Right here in a couple trifoliates, we're going to start setting nodes, which is really going to drive that yield. And it's these things right now where we just can't go backwards, right? You don't get a mulligan. I'm not good at golf, but you don't get a mulligan, right? You don't get an extra down. You don't get a do-over. It's the things that we're doing right now that can really start to pay those dividends, right, at the end of the year. So, Ben, I love it when I get a visit with guys like you that have had a chance to really work in agriculture and you're doing it yourself. If you could kind of boil it down to just one thing that you've really changed your view on in the last couple of years, what would you tell me that is?
That's a good question, John. There's a lot of things, and some of them don't even have to do with fertilizer or nutrition. But if I had to put my finger on one thing, organic acids are just mind-boggling what they can accomplish for you. It's one of those things, and it's kind of a joke, but it's really not. It's like, well, what do you want it to do for you? When we talk about humic acid. again, it's a joke, but it's really not, because when we talk about humic acid with the 32% application, all of a sudden we're starting to talk about keeping it in the ammonium form a little bit longer, which is what a plant wants to take up. Or if we're talking about it in furrow, all of a sudden we're with the starter, we're talking about maybe buffering some salt content or stimulating root growth. And that's just two or three things that just pop right off to my head. But humic acids, a good formulated humic acid, I should say, because humic acids are not new, right? They've been around for a long time. Hell, probably longer than you, John. I'm not sure. But they've been around for quite a while. But we figured out the extraction process, right, to keep everything intact and get all the goodies out of that leonardite without hurting that final product.
Yeah. I think that's perfect, right? And I think it's such a key thing going forward. Again, the farm bill that's coming out with biostimulants, I even think that's where we're going to really see some big leaps and bounds as we go forward. But as we kind of get wrapped up, right, I know it's still early, start walking fields and doing a yield analysis. I love that. So, Ben, I really appreciate your time. I do hope that you guys pick up a little bit more sun, a little bit more heat units. I know we could use it at home, mainly just to dry out, but even here in Western Illinois, they're going to need a little bit of drying to get back in the field and get going. But I do want us to start thinking about that next step, though, as well, right? Oftentimes I get tunnel vision. I think, man, we're going to come in and we're going to side dress, and I'm going to be good for a while. But we still have that last step. And so I just want to challenge guys, as you're out in the field and as we're looking at a really good developing crop. I mean, I'm just seeing great crops across the regions that I've been traveling. I want us to start thinking, what's that next step? And the common theme continues to be the right nutrients at the right time, and still trying to help mitigate that stress, right? Capturing the value so that when we come through and shell that corn or cut those beans here in the fall, we're going to have binfuls. So, Ben, I really...
Corey Hillebo back again with Dr. John Murphy from Ag Explorer, and we are talking white paper still, and this one is specifically on Onward Max, a PGR, and that's one of them buzzwords that we go back and find the Farm for Profit episode with Gunny that we talked PGRs, but... Yeah. What specifically did you guys research on this Onward Max white paper, John?
Yep, definitely. So this white paper right here is specific about Onward Max with corn.
Okay.
And we replicated it at 3 different locations. And again, we replicated it because we want to see how it acts across a whole bunch of different environments. Third party, right? So CRO, we had nothing in it other than we supplied the product and we set up the experiment. And the great thing about this Onward Max really boils down to the ROI. And we can talk about how we got there.
Yeah.
But the thing with Onward Max, it's a 91% success rate.
Wow.
That number is almost unheard of. It makes me nervous to even say it.
Yeah.
But we have 100+ trials that show we have about a 91% success rate.
The biggest thing I see with this is it seems like it has a very specific time.
Yes.
So what is the timing on this product?
Yep, I love that you brought that up. Everything about Onward Max is about late season. So it is a 3-way PGR that's designed to help mitigate stress and help enhance grain fill. And I think those are 2 key things and honestly hot topics that we've been hearing this year with Southern Rust go through.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. So PGR, what is it, and then what is in Onward Max?
Yep, so a PGR, it's a regulator, so we can think about it as a signaler. People call it hormones, but what it's doing is we're applying it to the plant to bring about some type of change. That's how I look at a PGR. So let's talk Onward Max. Onward Max is a 3-way PGR, specifically designed for that late season. So it has chitin, has choline chloride, and then it has the Aaron Judge, I like to call it has GABA that's going to be in there, which I think is the big heavy hitter, right?
Yep.
It's the home runs when we go in and we need them.
Yep.
So let's just real brief, if that's all right,
Yeah.
talk about what those 3 things do.
Absolutely.
So chitin and choline chloride, they've been around since the 1970s, right? You think 5 traditional PGRs, they kind of fall into that window. Chitin is all about reproductive success, flowering, pollination. That's where I put my chitin late season. Choline chloride, I think, is a really neat kind of older PGR because what choline chloride does is it helps keep the chlorophyll from breaking down. So let's talk about that for a second. We get late season, the sunlight starts to kind of shorten up, we get some stresses, our plants start to yellow. What's happening is the plants are naturally breaking down that chlorophyll. The problem with that is then we lose grain fill duration, right? And grain fill duration, as you and I were just talking, I really think that's one of the biggest yield components we have, because if I can gain myself an extra 10, 14, 21 days of grain fill, now all of a sudden I'm talking test weight.
Yep.
And so that's our second one. And then the third one is that GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid. And there's two big things with that: stress mitigation. And so we know plants can get stressed just like you and I do, right? When you're in the combine running, you had a lot of cortisol that was pumping through the body, right? You got irritated, you didn't eat right, your cells weren't working right. That's right.
Maybe we should make a drink.
That's right. But GABA does the same thing in plants. It helps to mitigate that ethylene, which is a stress hormone.
Okay. That makes a whole lot of sense. So now let's talk ROI of this white paper. Looked like it was 12 bushels across those studies, which correlates to $49 ROI. That's
pretty
crazy.
Phenomenal, isn't it?
Yeah.
And like we said, with a 91% success rate. And this is why I like to tell people that kind of 11 to 12 bushel, that's a great number. We like to tell people it's 5% of your yield. So if you're in 220 bushel an acre corn, you're going to be over that. You're at 200 bushel an acre corn, our data shows you're usually going to be running right around that 10 bushel. It is just a very consistent across every crop we put it on.
And this is specifically for that fungicide timing, correct?
Yes. Yep. It is specific to late season, right? So if you're making a fungicide pass of that VT brown silk on corn, that's where we want to put it. Soybeans, it's kind of that R2, R2.5, if we want to call that R3. Getting it on with the fungicide, we don't want an extra pass, right? Because no one's going to do it. But I also like to tell people it's best if you lead the stress. Right? Once your plant is stressed, you can't ever go back and get the yield. You only preserve from that point on. So if you can lead that stress, my opinion, that's the best time for it.
Do you think that it should always go with a fungicide, or can it stand by itself?
No, it can stand by itself as well. And we have great trials. I always tell people as I travel, I've learned some areas you need 2 passes of fungicide. Let's be honest, I've seen 3. But there's a lot of places that aren't running any fungicide. And this is still going to be that plant health pass. It's going to mitigate that stress and keep the plant going.
Yeah, specifically here in Iowa, I don't know if you'll ever get anyone to not use a fungicide again after southern rust this year. But I mean, it's not always southern rust. That's not an every year problem. But we got tar spot and other, northern and all that other stuff. So it's definitely a great time to get that on. And man, I'm a believer in the late season now. This year more than ever. It looked like November on September 15th, and the yield maps show. So I actually have some trials of this out myself that I probably could write my own white paper on.
It'd probably be better than mine.
I can't wait to dig into that stuff after harvest. But you heard it here first. Another great product from Ag Explorer and their white papers. Always learning, always improving.